Let me start off by just saying how awesome it is to be in a room with people again. Give yourselves a round of applause. The last couple of Voices for Children events, I did them in a room in our house all by myself. And when they were over, I sat there and just kind of reflected on how the world has changed when you have hundreds of people and you have to do an event like that by yourself. And so I'm really, really, really thrilled to welcome you all to this space. And I think before we go much further, we should appreciate the people who have prepared these meals and served them to us today. It's critically important that we recognize them. So as Brian mentioned, Children's Alliance is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and we're really, really thrilled to have the opportunity to move the organization forward. We had a big celebration in April in our offices where we had the opportunity to appreciate the founders who were wise enough to create an organization that has had some tremendous wins for children and families in the state of Washington. During that time, I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the legislative victories that we were able to achieve this year during this legislative session. A huge celebration around the idea that we were able to extend access to high-quality early learning opportunities for children all around the state. That this year we were able to, with a lot of other partners, achieve a victory that Children's Alliance has been working on for more than 13 years, providing dental access through dental therapists to providers all over, or children all over the state. That we were able to respond very quickly to the overwhelming number of children that are reporting behavioral and emotional mental health issues, and that we were able to drive funding into supporting those children in that challenge. That we were able to work in coalition with other partners to make sure that Washington State is one of the states that now bans female genital mutilation. There's so many children that are affected by that in the state. And we had some partners here who done wonderful work in leadership in getting us to recognize that issue and then act on it with communities. And then we had one really big judicial win that was not a legislative win, which is where we spend most of our time, but a judicial win. And that was around the capital gains tax. For those of you who read Danny Westneat, and I don't know that everybody reads Danny Westneat, but for those of you that read the Times columnist, he wrote this week about the fact that there's more than $850 million going into the state coffers just in this short period of time this year as a result of the capital gains tax being upheld by the Supreme Court. And we had a big role to play in that. One of our members is actually a party in the suit on that, and we recruited her to participate in that suit. I wrote a amicus brief that was accepted by the Supreme Court and informed the decision that they made. And as I sat in the room on January 26th, right behind the lawyers who were arguing the case in oral arguments, I was reflecting a little bit on all the impacts that our organization can have. I was looking forward to today when we have the opportunity to celebrate the fact that Children's Alliance is at the tables and can have an impact on decisions that are being made that advantage children and families in our state. And I'm very excited about our expansion. The fact that our board recently has voted to approve an expansion of our operations so that we can serve more children and families throughout the state, that we can reach out to legislators and have deep, profound conversations, particularly with those who have been voting against children's issues, and that we can more authentically reach out to communities and families all across the state. One of our key values is that we advocate with communities. We don't advocate for communities, and that requires that we have a statewide presence, and that's something that we plan to lean into in this next year. And so all of this, all of the work that we aspire to do in the future requires that we have adequate funding in the state legislature or in state government to be able to operate these programs. And that requires that we have serious conversations about wealth and serious conversations about the tax code that impacts our ability to create wealth. And so I am so excited by the idea of bringing Dr. Brown to the stage to talk with us about that issue. Dr. Brown, I got the opportunity to pick her up at the airport yesterday, and we spent most of the drive into town talking about issues having to do with this. I had to cut her off at some point and say, save that for, save it for the conversation that we're going to have tomorrow. And so before I bring her up, let me do a quick introduction. Dr. Brown holds the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation at Georgetown University Law School and is an advocate for economic and social justice. She's the author of the book, The Wealth of Whiteness, or The Whiteness of Wealth. Let me slow down here. The Wealth of Whiteness. That's a Freudian slip that I need to work on. She's the author of The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. She's well known for her work in a variety of areas. The effects of tax policy by race, class, and or gender, workplace equity and inclusion, and law school reform. Interestingly, Dorothy was born and raised in the South Bronx and learned about structural inequality at an early age. It made her want to become a lawyer so that she could be an advocate for those whose voices have been silenced or ignored. Her journey included the study of tax law, working on Wall Street, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and currently as a law professor. Once she joined the Legal Academy, she focused on revealing the previously hidden racial as well as class and gender implications of tax policy. She's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and Bloomberg, and has written numerous opinion pieces addressing current events in the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN Opinion, The Washington Post, Forbes, National Law Journal, and Bloomberg News. With all of that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown to the stage. So, as I shared, Dr. Brown was really excited to get here. This doesn't happen very often, but I got notice that her flight was going to arrive extra early yesterday, and I was struggling to get to SeaTac in time to visit with her. So your book, The Whiteness of Wealth, was my favorite read last year, and I'm thrilled to have this fireside chat with you about it. It joins with several recent books like The New Jim Crow, The Color of Law, Castes, and last year's speaker here, Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, as rigorously researched and compelling critiques of the impartiality of our institutions. You also ground your research in your own personal experience and that of your family. For those of you who have not read it yet, and I mean yet, because you should all read it, please share your story about what compelled you to write the book.
So I came to this work accidentally. as a good daughter with a master's in tax law, I prepared my parents' tax returns. And I'm working on Wall Street, and I, by myself, am making a little bit more than my parents are combined. My mother's a nurse, my father was a plumber, and under our progressive tax system, I should be paying a lot more taxes than they are. Now, I paid more taxes than they did, but I didn't pay a lot more taxes. And I would do their returns. It was very straightforward, and I could never quite figure out why they were paying so much in taxes. So, but April 15th would roll around, I'd do their returns, and then I'd get back to work because I had a real job, right? As opposed to when I became an academic, but I digress. Okay, so I, it would always nag me in the back of my head why my parents pay so much in taxes, and then the next April 5th would roll around, and the next April 5th. So eventually, I became a law professor, and this particular semester, I'm teaching partnership tax. Now, there's tax, and there's partnership tax. Partnership tax is single-handedly the most difficult course to teach in all of tax law. So naturally, I stalled. I didn't really want to prepare for partnership tax, so I picked up this article that I'd been saving, and I said, oh, today's the day to read it because it's either this or it's partnership tax. So I picked up the article, and in there, and the title of the article was Toward Developing a Black Legal Scholarship. And the author was a mentor of mine, and he made the argument that all black law professors should look for the role of race in whatever area of law they taught, and they should explain it. So I knew this article had nothing to do with me and had nothing to do with tax law because the only color that mattered was green. So I just thought this would be a nice, informative article. About 3 or so pages from the end, he asked the question, how do you know there isn't a race and tax question if you don't look? And I went, what? So I kept reading, I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I'm gonna do something. So I decided to look to see what race and tax had to do with each other. And I discovered for the first time something that I should have realized decades earlier, which is that the IRS doesn't publish statistics by race. How is it I have a master's degree in tax law from NYU and I don't know this? It was never mentioned in any of my classes. And I thought, but I'm fairly determined. So the fact that there was no race and tax data from the IRS didn't stop me. I said, okay, I just have to figure this out a different way. Instead of looking at race and tax data, I will look for race data and I will apply a tax lens. One day I came across a study that the US Commission on Civil Rights on the economic status of black women produced. So I'm reading the report and I come across a line that says something to the effect, married black wives contribute 40% to household income and married white wives contribute 29%. Now, to anyone else, they're thinking, oh, this is the same old story that black wives work more than white wives. And black women have worked more outside the home than white women have historically. But to my tax eyes, I struck gold because I know how our joint return operates. And how our joint return operates is you have 3 choices when you get married from a tax law perspective. Your taxes could stay the same, your taxes could go up, which is called a marriage penalty, or your taxes could go down, which is called the marriage bonus. If you contribute, if 2 spouses contribute household income and one does not contribute more than 20%, that household gets a tax cut. They get the marriage bonus. If you have 2 relatively equal wage earners, that household pays more taxes. And what I didn't tell you about my parents' taxes is my mother and my father made almost identical amounts. So this one statistic gave me the information to solve the mystery of my parents' tax returns. They paid so much in taxes because they were married to each other.
Wow.
So remember that the next time somebody says, people just need to get married and they'll get out of poverty.
Right.
No.
Indeed. Early in the book, you lay out a brief history of taxation in the United States, progressive taxes, and the concept of horizontal equity. Can you briefly share why those concepts matter here?
So, in the beginning, after the 16th Amendment was enacted and we had a federal income tax in 1913, the only people who paid taxes were rich white Americans, which was good for the rest of us, except the people who were annoyed were rich white Americans. So they figured out ways to not have to pay as many taxes. And it worked, or I should say, only rich white Americans are paying taxes until World War II. After World War II occurred, federal government needed more money, taxes went up, and it moved from being a class tax where only the rich paid it to a mass tax where everybody else paid it. So we had World War II, as a result of World War II, like in 1942, we had withholding. You know, it's hard to imagine that there was a point in time when we didn't have withholding. And we didn't, because most workers, almost all workers, didn't pay taxes. So there was no need for withholding. But after the expansion of World War II, we needed withholding, and then the rest of us paid taxes. And I'll just, point out that in the 1940s, Black Americans were brought into the tax-paying public like their white peers, except we had federal programs that excluded benefits to Black Americans. So Black taxpayers are paying for benefits they're denied getting. But none of this would be known because the IRS doesn't publish statistics by race. Okay, so, it's really important to think about data collection. It's really important to think about what can't we know if we don't have the data, and to think about how the IRS and Treasury has been, it's changing, but has been an outlier. Because think of all the government data on race that's out there. We know homeownership rates by race. We know labor rates by, wages by rates. We know all of this information because the government publishes it. But Treasury and IRS has been this little island that until the whiteness of wealth came along, nobody really was talking about race and tax. And now we have a couple of studies that show, yes, race and tax are related, and we have these tax breaks that are disproportionately received by white Americans. Okay, so you raised the question of horizontal equity. And when we think about horizontal equity, another part of our progressive tax system is based on ability to pay. The higher your income, the more you can afford to pay, which is why, in the very beginning, the only people who paid were rich white Americans, because they had the greatest ability to pay. So now we have an income tax system where as your income increases, your tax rate is supposed to increase. It doesn't, because we have loopholes like the capital gains taxation at the federal income level, right? But putting the loopholes aside, the argument is as follows. A household with $100,000 should be paying more than a household with $50,000 of income. And horizontal equity would say one household with $100,000 is the same as any household with $100,000. And one of the things I push back in the book is if you have a single wage earner household, married couple, spouse A makes $100,000, spouse B stays at home, works at home, and you have a different married couple where spouse A and spouse B contribute $50,000 each, tax law would tell us those couples are equal, but they're not. One household that has a $100,000 income is going to get tax-free benefits. Those jobs tend to come with health insurance. They tend to come with retirement accounts. They tend to come with all kinds of tax-free subsidies, and the subsidy of the value of services the stay-at-home spouse is providing that the U.S. doesn't tax, but other European countries do. Whereas the two-income earner, $50,000, not only do those jobs typically not come with those tax-free benefits, health insurance, retirement accounts, that couple is finding ways of paying for two cars, paying for child care, often with after-tax dollars, But the law would tell us that those two households are equal. And I push back on that in the book, and I say there's no way those two households are equal. And if you had your choice, you know which one you'd rather live in.
So, thank you for that. I think that is, in many ways, when I understood that, then I could understand the rest of the book. And I understand that tax policy is very complicated, but I'm hyper aware of how policy has disparate impacts on different races of people. And I think you did a really good job in that chapter of making that clear. So,
and I will say one other thing. Tax policy isn't that complicated. People want you to think it's complicated so that you don't understand what they're doing as they're taking money out of your pocket and put it into theirs, okay?
Right.
So if you ever hear someone explain something and you're like, I don't get that, and they go, oh, yeah, it's complicated. No. It's not. You just don't want to tell me the truth. Okay. Proceed.
Point well taken. Point well taken. I'm curious, and I'm going off script here. I'm really curious as to why do you believe that the IRS has been reluctant to publish data by race?
Well, that's such a good question. Okay, so first I'm going to say all of these comments are in my capacity as Dorothy Brown Law Professor. So I'm also a member of the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. I'm not speaking in that capacity, let me be clear. Okay, Law Professor, Professor Brown, you know, there are a couple of reasons. The IRS has consistently used this colorblind veil as a defense against any challenge on race. So for years I've been talking about race and tax, and for years the IRS has said we don't discriminate on the basis of race. How could we? We don't know a taxpayer's race. So they are dogmatic in saying we can't possibly discriminate because we don't know. Now, if I have any social scientists in the room, you know, not quite. Because here's what your tax return has. Your first name, your last name, your zip code. We live in a very racially segregated America. So if you could give me those three things, I could kind of tell you with a pretty degree of certainty what race I'm talking about for any individual tax return. And in fact, think tanks and other researchers have used that information to impute race on research. Okay, but the IRS's defense is we cannot possibly discriminate because we don't have race data, which means they don't want to get in the business of race data because then somebody can say they're discriminating. And one of my friends once said to me, and I've never forgotten it, Dorothy, how bad must the data be? Because they don't even want to know, much less look to fix. And here's a hint at how bad the data must be. In January, a group of economists co-authored a study, we refer to it as a Stanford study because a couple of the co-authors are out of Stanford, that looked at actual tax return data. And they found if you applied for the Earned Income Tax Credit and you were black, you were 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited than if you were non-black. 3 to 5 times. How bad is that? Really bad. And now the IRS, because of the study, because of my book, because it got so much attention, the IRS has to deal with it. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with the IRS commissioner who had just released a letter. Let me back up. Stanford study comes out. We're in the process of getting a new IRS commissioner. So he's on Capitol Hill testifying so he could get confirmed. And in front of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden and some others basically said, this racial audit disparity study, what are you doing about that? Oh, yes, Senator. The to-be IRS commissioner says that's really bad. Senator Wyden says, I want a report in 60 days. I want you to tell me what happened and what you're doing to fix it. And I'm like, you know, jumping out of my chair, go Wyden, go Wyden. Well, the IRS issued a letter and they acknowledged that the study was right and that they've got to fix it, okay? That is miraculous. They would have never done it had that Stanford study that the Stanford authors say my book inspired. They looked at it because they read my book, right? If the Stanford study had not been done and got as much attention as they did in the middle of the IRS commissioner trying to get confirmed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But, you know, it was a wonderful, perfect storm. So now the IRS can't say, oh, we don't discriminate on the basis of race, because they've now acknowledged that they have.
Got it. So you're in Seattle now, and there's the interesting story of Harry and Charlotte Seaborn, who grew up in Seattle, lived about 3 miles from where we are right now, and their story about going to the Supreme Court forms the first part of your book, a big part of the first part of your book. So would you share their story?
And this is one of those, I teach this, I've taught this for literally decades, and never knew the backstory of the Seaborns until my agent said, tell me something about that case. So then I did research, and I found out the following. So Henry and Charlotte Seaborn were one of those rich white Americans paying taxes. You know, for some years it was 1%, other years 5%. Most Americans didn't pay taxes. And they decided, I don't want to pay taxes. Well, I don't want to pay as many taxes. So they and their tax advisors, the precursor to Perkins Coie, decides to...
We have a Perkins Coie.
Perkins Coie, yeah. I'm like, you know, hey, I give credit where it's due, okay? They gave some really great tax advice. So they basically tell the Seaborns, it's Henry basically made all the money. Give Charlotte half of your money, and she'll be taxed at a lower rate than if you're taxed on all of it. Good idea. IRS says bad idea, and the IRS says you can't do it. They go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says you can, because Washington State is a community property state. So she had a right to half of it anyway. Well, that made the Henry and Charlottes very happy because they got a tax cut. Henry and Charlotte's in community property states won. There was a companion case, Lucas v. Earl, in a non-community property state. They lost. The Supreme Court said because the stay-at-home spouse doesn't have a right to half, they were trying to do it by contract, doesn't work. So the rich Henrys in separate state properties didn't like that, so they had a choice. We could convert to community property and give up half our money to our stay-at-home spouses. They didn't want to do that. Or they go to Congress, and Congress passed this thing called the joint return in 1948, which treated everybody the way Henry and Charlotte were treated, except the stay-at-home spouse got no legal rights. Okay? So we have the joint return because of the Seaborns. And Perkins Coie.
We were intentional about getting a Perkins Coie representative to be here today. So can you explain how seemingly race-neutral tax codes have such a negative consequence for home ownership and wealth creation for families of color, particularly relevant in one of the most residentially segregated cities in the United States, here in Washington, in Seattle?
So when I wrote about homeownership and race, I got into a lot of trouble. Or I should say, I got a lot of pushback from law professor faculties across the country. And because most people don't want to think they're part of the problem, right? So homeownership works differently for white homeowners than it does for black homeowners. And it's a function of where white homeowners live versus where black homeowners live. And the social science research that shows if a neighborhood has more than 10% black homeowners, the value of the property falls. And as the percentage of black neighbors increases, the percentage of the value of the homes decrease. So you have 10% or you have 12%, you have a dip. If you have 20%, a greater dip. You have 50%, a greater dip. And what we see is black homeowners tend to live in racially diverse or all-black neighborhoods, whereas most white homeowners tend to live in overwhelmingly white neighborhoods. Now, what we know, one of the things that came out in January of this year was Treasury actually did a study on tax expenditures by race, one of which was the mortgage interest deduction. It also looked at capital gains. Over 90% go to white Americans. The 20% tax break for business owners, over 90% go to white taxpayers. So there are lots of things in there. But one of the things that I found interesting that I've always thought of is high-income Black and Hispanic taxpayers have a slightly higher mortgage interest deduction than their white peers. And I've always thought that that might be the case because of subprime lending. Subprime lending specifically targets high-income Black and Hispanic Americans. So yeah, you get a higher mortgage interest deduction and you're not building up equity, right? Or as I like to say, if it's so good, how come white Americans aren't doing it? Because it's not so good, okay? So, homeownership in terms of wealth building doesn't work the same way it does for Black Americans as white Americans. Because to me, the real tax break is not mortgage interest deduction, it's the exclusion from gain on sale, Section 121. When you sell your home at a gain, you can get $500,000 of gain tax-free if you're married and $250,000 if you're single. That's wealth. You imagine, you buy a house for $200,000, you sell it for $700,000, you make a gain of $500,000, and that goes in your pocket and it's not taxed. So who's most likely to get that housing appreciation? It's white homeowners, not Black homeowners. So when we talk about homeownership and when we talk about expanding opportunities for homeownership, I think we should have more homeowners regardless of race, but I think we need to understand that just like homeownership is a driver of the white middle class post-World War II, it can never be that for Black homeowners because our homes are not valued the way white homes are. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that yes, it will produce wealth, but it won't produce as much wealth, and you want to stay away from home equity loans because you just don't know what the value of your home is going to be at the end of the day.
Right. So you ground your work in the stark reality that the median white family wealth is about 8 times that of the median Black family's wealth. Yet most white Americans think that for every $100 of wealth that they have, they think that Black families have $90 of wealth. So they think that the gap is that big, but it's really that big. How can we ever solve income inequality when there's a perception gap that is that big?
Well, I don't know that we as a country have decided we want to educate people about this, right? So ignorance is bliss. If I actually think it's a $10 disparity, it's not a big deal. I can sleep at night. I don't have to worry about my role. But if we actually want to fix it, then we're going to have to inform people of uncomfortable truths and how they benefit from the status quo, which is a really difficult conversation, but one that's necessary, right? So we started this racial reckoning in 2020, and it's gone off the rails. In fact, we've had a backlash to the racial reckoning because I like to joke, the reason why we're in this backlash moment right now is because the kids who were marching went home for Thanksgiving and started fussing at grandma and grandpa, and they didn't like it, right? And I joke, but it's not too far from the truth that people started asking questions. Mommy, Daddy, you were alive during desegregation. Were you out there holding signs, or were you fighting for Black children to get into the buildings, right? So I think there is value to many white Americans in ignorance, and I think it's hard for people to speak truth to people who don't want to hear it. So one of the best parts of my job is I have tenure. And And I don't really care if you don't like what I'm saying, okay? There's always a door. There's always an option, but I'm gonna say it. And I don't have any fear whatsoever of consequences because I have no interest in politics. I have no interest in another job. I'm very happy where I am. So it liberates me to say things like that. And I think more people need to say things like that, which leads us into a reparations conversation, right? Because that's how we fix it. But in order to get there, we need to do some groundwork, and we need to have some conversations, and we need more white allies stepping up, right? So for me, the next part of this phase or the next part of this conversation is really white people talking to white people. It ain't about me, it's about y'all, right? Because you're in the rooms, I'm not, and when I say it, I have a bias. When you say it, you're a hero, so be a hero.
Yeah. In my work in integrated schools, we call that from white lips to white ears. The fact that a black person like yourself who is steeped in the research and the knowledge can say it, but white ears can't hear it. Sometimes it takes white lips to white ears in order for those types of things to be heard. A person who was sitting in a chair similar to this one talking to you, her name is Emily Stewart. She asked, how can white people be good allies, knowing all of this?
So the first thing is when you're in rooms with people of color, like listen to us, and then carry it into rooms we're not. So part of it is about education and self-education and humility. And when you mess up, I mess up, we all mess up. When you mess up, just say you're sorry. You know, it's so easy to say, and then it takes a lot of the pressure off because a lot of white allies don't speak for fear of offending and for fear of saying something that's gonna be turned against them. And you just have to recognize that it's gonna happen. The first time is probably the hardest. After that, you get used to it. Like, I'm sorry, right? I said it, I didn't mean it, so help me not do it again. Tell me what I said wrong. And most people will get it and be very forgiving and help you because we need all the allies we can get. But it's gonna take a certain amount of courage to step, you know, or as I once heard somebody say, do it afraid. It's okay to be afraid and do it. Because the first time you're afraid, the second time you're not as afraid, the third time you're like, oh, I got this, right? So the more you do it, the better it is. And if you hear something offensive and you're in a room with other people of color, don't sit back and wait for the person of color to say, you call it out, right? That would mean more to us than anything. Because, you know, it's like, oh, God. You know, somebody says something and then everybody in the room looks at me. Don't look at me, right? You know, somebody say this, it shouldn't be my job. When did it get to be my job, right? So allies speak up for us after listening, or I call it doing the homework.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so that we're not centering whiteness, in your book you talk about defensive actions that black people can take. What would be some of those defensive actions that we can take until we see a better world at some point, or see better tax policy?
So when I think about home ownership, you know, if you know the research out there shows you're not going to get as much out of your home if you have more than 10% black neighbors, yet you choose to live in that neighborhood, then don't be house poor, don't spend all of your money on your home, and under no circumstances take out a home equity loan so that you keep as much equity in the home as possible. If you can't max out, you know, if you work at a job where you have access to a retirement account and you can't max out, put something in. And a trick my mother always used to do is whenever she got a raise, she would put it in a retirement account. Because she would say, I didn't have the money the day before I got the raise. I don't know I have it the day after. So, you know, you can do things like that. If you have children, see if you can put some money in a 529 account. If you have, instead of your relatives or the child's relatives giving them money, say, here, put it in the 529 account, or you put it in the 529 account, so that when your child goes to school, they'll graduate with less debt, because Black college student debt is killing our kids' futures. And if there's a way for you to help them not graduate with a lot of debt, that would be a gift that would keep on giving.
That's great. I could spend all day talking to you, but I see people drawing me to a close. So I want to close out with a little bit of hope. I'm wondering, what gives you hope in this strange time that we're living through with debt limit conversations and cutting programs to people who are hungry? What gives you hope?
So what gives me hope are my students. So I taught critical race theory as a 1L elective at Georgetown this fall, and those students are on fire, which no matter how I was feeling, I could not leave class without being on fire. So, my students give me hope because they're gonna be out there running things, and they're wonderful, and they're gonna set me straight. So I don't feel like I have to fix this. I just have to do my part and then pass the torch to them. So my students give me a lot of hope.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. So join me really quickly in thanking Professor Brown for sharing so much knowledge and wisdom with us today.